Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. We're going to get into plants and animals. More specifically, we're going to talk about their migration patterns and how they actually do have a mechanism for passing information from generation to generation, and not just at the genetic level. More specifically, in order to find this out, we had to analyze, they had to analyze migration patterns. So this article from phys.org talks about this study conducted by University of Wyoming researchers, and what the study revealed was that specifically big game animals like bighorn sheep and moose, they have to learn to migrate to pass knowledge across generations. So migrating, it's not like with birds and insects where it's in their DNA to migrate from like the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere, or anything like that. They don't really have a built-in genetic mechanism that guides them in migration. What they need is like a social structure, and they need to have been familiar with the land for generations and generations. So the study is really interesting, and I'll connect it later to humans. But let's go through everything really quick. So again, this is out of the University of Wyoming, and these are the two researchers, Matt Kaufman and Kevin Monteith. So this is an actual photo of them releasing a cow moose. So what they did was they put GPS collar in this picture. They put a GPS collar on it just to help with their research. But anyway, so the cool thing about this research is it's cutting edge, and because it provides the first empirical evidence of that hooved mammals must learn where and when to migrate. Now, for a long time, this was hinted at in other studies, but the thing is, in order to find out definitively that it's learned, the study has to be a long period of time for them to study. I'm talking decades. So what they did was they made use of a grand experiment that has been occurring across the American West for over the last 60 years. So 6 decades this research has been ongoing. So this is like the 1950s. What they found basically confirmed what they thought all along, which is the ungulates, that's the fancy term for hooved mammals, they learn to migrate from their mothers or other animals in the herd. So how did they find this out? There was a population of bighorn sheep that kind of got decimated from hunting and disease. So what the wildlife conservationists did, they put into effect a translocation program that to help save the remnants from that decimated herd, and then to translocate them somewhere else so they could replenish their numbers and reestablish their colony, so to speak. So they compared this translocated group to an already established group, and apparently there was a pattern that came out. So what they did was they gathered the GPS data, and then that data revealed that fewer than 9% of the translocated animals migrated, but the ones that had never been lost, the established herds, 65 to 100% of the animals migrated there. So just to be clear, there was a surviving group of ungulates. They divided that group. One, they translocated them to a different location, and the others they put in an already established group. The ones in the established group already migrated, like they picked up on how to migrate within that established group's migration corridor or path, whereas the other ones, they didn't. They were in unfamiliar territory, unfamiliar with their habitat, and they did not migrate. So this supports the notion that migration requires extended periods for animals to explore, learn the location of where all the nutritious food is, the elevations, and what's high, what's low, all that stuff along the landscape. And also, once they learn that, they need to pass that on to other herd members, including offspring. What this says is migration is a socially learned behavior within these populations. and they're considered to be part of an animal's culture. So kind of like with human society, we share cultural knowledge based on where we live, based on geographic location. We have different values, and we have different learned behaviors. Well, this is no different with these ungulates. And and also ungulates are notoriously smart animals. I mean, if you talk to any farmer who deals with cows, they'll tell you cows they're like puppies. They're smart. Horses, same thing. They're really smart. So is there a link between this and intelligence and culture? Yeah, I think so. I think that kind of, it doesn't for a long time, I think culture has this not stigma, but there's this attached assumption that you need a certain level of intelligence, i.e. like human intelligence, to even have a culture. But I think that that's BS now. This kind of, I think having an established culture is not a uniquely human thing anymore. I think it's just innate in all these living beings. So yeah, I don't know. I think this is a really interesting study. It kind of breaks that assumption, so to speak. So that thing they found out, the researchers. The second thing that they wanted to find out was how long would it take for them to learn a new migration pattern. One thing that they knew for certain was once the migration patterns are learned, there's a specific technique that these herd animals use, and that's to surf the green waves of nutritious food. So kind of in the article they make a parallel between actual surfing and surfing waves from in the ocean to surfing the so-called green wave of nutritious food that grows in certain times of the year. So what they do is they knew this much. They coordinated their movements to graze on plants sprouting along the mountain slopes. Makes sense, right? It increases their chance of survival, to have offspring, because they have the highest quality food. They survive and reproduce and all that stuff. So for some ungulates, green wave surfing is highly coordinated across vast landscapes, lasting weeks or months. So they learn this behavior over a long period of time. So how long did it take for them to learn this? To answer this question, again, they used GPS collar tracking data from 267 bighorn sheep and 189 moose. Some of the animals had just been released in unfamiliar landscapes, while others had occupied their ranges for decades or even centuries. So similar to the previous study, the first part of the study. So what they did from comparing both of these groups was they found that the long established herds, having acquired information over generations, were better at finding nutritious food than the translocated animals. That makes sense based on what we learned before, right? But most importantly, the translocated herds learned to better surf green waves over the course of many decades. So they improved over time. And those that surf better were more likely to migrate, obviously. So it took nearly 40 years for the reintroduced bighorn sheep to become 80% migratory. So 40 years. Moose didn't become migratory until after 90 years. And it's not one moose living 90 years. This is like a few generations of moose living in the same spot. So the first generation would kind of, they're the most unfamiliar, right? They're going around and exploring. Maybe the brighter ones kind of got more of the information first. From there, they had their children, and then their offspring kind of picked up where they left off, and then until finally maybe one of the generations finally circumnavigated their whole territory, and then from there the migration patterns kind of got more and more ingrained, and that's why it took 40 years to get to 80%. So I'm guessing in 50 years it'll probably be 90% or something like that. It'll just keep getting higher until it's a close enough knit moose society that they're 100% migratory. So it's really interesting. So if you see it made me realize that, let's say a group of, let's take an extinct animal for a second, like the mammoth, the woolly mammoth, right? Their migration patterns before they went extinct, if they were migrating, it probably took them years, like maybe 100 years to have been there to begin with. So if we find bones along a certain migratory route that are woolly mammoth bones, we can assume that they weren't just passing through. we can assume that they were there for many generations, at the very least 100 or 200 years. So that's a huge hint when you're trying to figure out other things. When you're cross-examining information, that's probably a huge feather in your cap if you're a scientist or a researcher trying to figure out something. This is now, it's no longer an assumption. This study makes it fact. So this is huge. This is a really important and long-standing research. I mean, 60 plus years of monitoring generations and generations of the same herd it's amazing. So the result, Jesmer says, the results indicate that ungulates accumulate knowledge of their landscapes over time, and cultural transmission of this knowledge is necessary for migrations to arise and persist. It also indicates that habitat quality is best imagined as the physical landscape that animals occupy, in combination with the knowledge they have accumulated about how to use that landscape. So when the ancient shamans and the people, natives who lived off the land, they kind of hit the nail on the head that the animals know the land, like they speak for the land, and that kind of sheds new light into what they're saying. Because if you don't have this context, it sounds kind of kooky, but they really do have knowledge, and they do communicate it in their own way across generations, across time. So they have this temporal ability. They have this ability to transmit information through time, and that's something that I think, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but that's something that was commonly thought to have been unique to humans, to transmit information over time. Now, the way we do it is through books, oral tradition. There's all kinds, like pictures. There's all kinds of ways we do it, and we probably do it better for us. But still, like, I mean, that the fact right here, the fact that there is a cultural transmission of knowledge among animals, that alone is, I think, groundbreaking right there. So this finding has important implications for the conservation of migration corridors. When migration corridors are lost, we also lose all knowledge animals had about how to make those journeys, which will likely take many decades or even a century to relearn. So if we open up a factory or something that messes with the ecology of the land, we lose a migration pattern that we didn't even know about, that knowledge is lost until another population gets located there, and they spend decades figuring out the land themselves, and then they get to spread it amongst their species. So this is really interesting. Like, we're kind of deleting libraries of information, except instead of in books, they're living within a species. So this study clearly indicates that the best way to conserve migration corridors is to protect the landscapes, obviously. By doing that, we'll maintain the cultural knowledge that helps sustain the abundant herds. So my guess would be the Native American Indians, let's say, when America in colonial times start, and the Lewis and Clark days, 300 plus years ago, they were migrating west and exploring and everything. They must have been mortified, because they probably knew this, because they followed the herds themselves. And they say themselves that the animals, they held some animals in higher regard than others, but they say that they learned the knowledge from the land and from the animals, and this takes on a whole new meaning. So what do you guys think? How important is this to you guys? Is this something that you guys also suspected as well? Is it something that you hadn't even thought of? Let me know in the comments. And that should do it. I'll see you guys tomorrow.